This here is an ocarina that I made a few years ago, and if anyone is familiar with the Pokémon franchise, it might look pretty familiar to you. This is a replica of the ocarina from Pokémon 2000. Now, a replica of the ocarina from that movie in of itself is nothing special. There's a ton of them out there. The difference with this one, though, is that it actually works. And what do I mean by it actually works? Of course, the replica ocarinas, a lot of them actually do play and make noise. However, in the movie, when this ocarina is played, you see that this shell attached to the side can be turned, and that in turn changes the key and the tone of the ocarina drastically. So is that even possible? You can't quite make it airtight, can you? I mean, you can't make two pieces of clay perfectly fit together, not after it's been fired in the kiln, and especially not with two different types of clay. So a way to work around this was, I thought, to line the inside of the turning key with foam or rubber or something like that. But that kind of defeats the idea of, is this ocarina even possible? Because the ocarina in the movie, while not given an exact age, is supposedly passed down from generation to generation and is quite old. So I highly doubt they would have had plastic or foam or something like that to actually put on the inside of the ocarina. So what I ended up going with was very, very thick and pressed together sheets of cotton. And they line the two sections where you turn. They line the base of the ocarina here, and not quite on the inside, but they line this section here. Now, it doesn't make it perfectly airtight, and you do have to hold it together with a fair bit of strength, but the idea is that it actually works. Now, does it actually have the range that the ocarina has in the movie? Not even close. Not even close. The ocarina in the movie, and keep in mind this is to exact scale, when you would turn the shell, it would go an entire octave up, which is just not even feasible with this. For this to go an octave up, it would have to be just as hollow and have the same inside area in the shell part as it would as the main chamber, which is going to be incredibly oversized, and at that point, its tiny little airway, which it has to have based on how small the actual part you blow into is not going to be able to cover that. In fact, I'm not even sure if it's possible to have a single airway cover 2 octaves. The highest amount of holes I have ever seen on a single chamber ocarina, and keep in mind the high notes were pretty airy at this point, was 14 holes with standard transverse fingering. And that equates to about 22 notes, which, if we're going to have 2 octaves on this thing, actually more than 2 octaves because of the fact that there's a thumb hole on the back, it's just not going to happen. The only way I was able to get this to work is to have this effectively change up to 3 notes, but for the most part, it's mainly used for creating sharps and flats. Now, unfortunately, because these two had to be tuned together, the ocarina itself can't properly function without its turning key. The only way you could do this is by covering and uncovering this hole yourself, which totally defeats the purpose, but when you think about it, this is actually a lot more simple than having a whole turning mechanism. Right down to the whole design of this ocarina from Pokémon 2000, it would be so much easier just to give it a wider range on its own or to add a second chamber than it would be to add a whole turning knob to it. But that's not what we're going for here. We're going for, can this actually work? Is this actually feasibly possible? And Cat is interrupting by climbing on my leg. You're not even supposed to be in here. Now, using cotton instead of plastic or foam actually did have a huge drawback on my initial design, whereas I was trying to make it so that it started low and when you actually turn this it would go higher. I had to completely reverse my way of thinking because while it did create an airtight seal of the cotton on the knob itself, when you actually went to turn it, this right here on the side could not create a perfect airtight seal, and it actually made it higher pitched. And in turn made it out of tune, because I was initially tuning it to be lower pitched when you actually turn it. And that is what this hole right here is. This little hole was dug precisely for retuning purposes, because now the ocarina was actually getting higher pitched. Whereas initially, while I was practicing with the wet clay, it was working to get lower pitch. In fact, it still does that on a couple of the notes, but it's so much drastically lower that it's not even playable at that point. But yeah, so I simply just dug a hole to retune it so that this, turning the knob now, can actually be used for sharps and flats. Now another thing to note is that on the chamber itself, it's actually a 90-degree cut. there's only a fourth of the section that's actually cut out and open. The reason it's half on this is just to have room for error. I found that if you cut it absolutely halfway on this, there's always going to be some air escaping, and there's nothing you can do about that. So that's the design I'm going with. 1/4 of this is cut out, and then on the actual turning knob itself, half is, to give you some room for error. And on some of the holes that require less air, you can actually skip a few notes in general just by turning it. And of course, you can turn it halfway to get some really precise tuning out of it. It's essentially like a pitch bend on a keyboard, except it's actually on an ocarina, a flute-like instrument. And that is the one plus side of actually having a turning knob like this, is the pitch bend is crazy accurate. But this is something that with minor practice could easily be done just by very slowly uncovering one of the holes. So once again, even though it does have a practical use in one aspect and it actually does a very good job of it, it can still be done a lot easier just with a standard ocarina. So you've seen in the video that, yes, this is possible. I designed this as closely as possible, looking for a bunch of reference points from different pictures and whatever, and of course, there are going to be some inconsistencies in the film because there are just inconsistencies between animators. They did not know how to draw this thing. So as reference while designing this, I looked at the closest up pictures that they had from the film, like the largest close-ups, to design the ocarina itself and the knob. So with the cotton actually making a solid cover and creating a solid tone for it, at least when it's turned shut, and when it's actually turned open, more air escapes and in turn makes it higher pitched. The cotton with just any adhesive which can be applied to the side of the ocarina, I did not glaze this part so it would stick a lot easier. And of course this doesn't have glaze on it to begin with other than the little gems. By using just clay, cotton, and just any adhesive that you could imagine, yes, this is possible, and it would fit into the time period. I give this a pass. This, by all accounts, is definitely possible. The songs that they play in the movie are not. Like, this ocarina would have to be much larger, and the knob itself would have to be completely redesigned and be even larger than the ocarina itself. This thing would have to be at least twice the size of the ocarina to actually make an octave change. But in terms of the knob actually being able to be turned to change the pitch of an ocarina, and the ocarina itself functioning as an instrument that at least has an octave, and heck, I was at least able to get 16 notes out of this. That's pretty good considering. I mean, that's more notes than a standard 5-hole ocarina, just because of this right here. So in the end, this ocarina is completely impractical, needlessly overcomplicated, and any benefit that you could have from a turning knob could be done better, or at the least be done much easier with just a standard ocarina. For the pitch bending, you could easily just move your fingers over one of the holes, and for getting sharps and flats, just add a small sub-hole to it. Something like, now here's an ocarina. Something like this. For the increased range, honest to God, this was so hard to do. It is immensely easier to add a second chamber and tune that with the first one. It's much easier to make a double ocarina than it is to even attempt this one. This is completely ridiculous. Well, overall, this was a very fun experiment to at least attempt, and I was surprised that it was actually possible. I can't believe I actually forgot about this. The reason that I'm coming out with this video now, instead of when I actually made this a few years ago, was because I was between jobs and I didn't have time to actually, continue work on this thing, and I had completely forgotten about it until I found it at the bottom of a box while I was cleaning out my workshop, and it's like, oh yeah, I remember this thing. But yeah, there you have it. It's entirely possible, it is real, it can be done, but good lord, good luck trying to get one of these to work. Because of how needlessly complicated these things are, and how impractical it is, I would highly recommend if you want an ocarina that actually has a good range and is playable and can do all sorts of fancy stuff, I would get a double ocarina like this one. Something that's a nice comfortable size, it has multiple sub-holes, and it has an extended range with a second chamber. It has large holes, which is easy for the whole pitch bending thing that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, overall this one is much easier to make. It's a lot more simple, easier to learn how to play because you have to actually like feel where you're turning this thing. You have to guess where it is. There's like no indication. You have to like see when it goes on and figure, okay, if I turn it this much, it's going to make that pitch. If I turn it this much, it's going to make that one. This is why I made it perfect cut down the middle, half and half, so there's a lot of room for error. But at the very least, like I said, it was a fun experiment. I don't know if I'm going to make more of these. I might in the future, but for now, I'm sticking with what I have, and this is no more than just a fun experiment. But yeah, there you go. It is possible. And it can be done in two ways. If you want to go with the whole foam and plastic thing, it might be a much more practical design to actually make this turn and make the ocarina lower pitched and tune it from there. However, if you're going to do that, because you have to take into account for clay shrinking and all sorts of stuff like that, it would be better just to make it from plastic to begin with, like the entire thing made of plastic.